Hey guys, Mr. Hallman here. Welcome to our next lesson in factoring. And this week we're actually going to pick up where we left off last week with reverse FOIL. So if you're keeping track, we've talked about GCF and difference of squares and perfect square trinomials. We reviewed that last week. And last week we introduced reverse FOIL, which is another way of factoring where we go from a trinomial, meaning we go from 3 terms, to 2 binomials. We're going to have 2 terms. So I have an example problem here to get us warmed up with. So if you want to pause real quick and try number 1 on your own, and then when you're ready, restart, and let's take a look at the answer. All right, so we have x squared minus 14x plus 24. Remember, reverse FOIL basically goes through 4 steps where we're going to try and force as much to work out as we can, and then we have a check step that is going to tell us whether or not our answer is correct. So the steps basically go in this order here to the right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to force the first multiplication to work out the way we want it to. So I'm going to set up my 2 binomials, and my first multiplication should give me the x squared. So that means we're going to split x squared into x and x. Next, we're going to force the signs to be what we want them to. So I'm going to look at the last term, which is a positive. Remember, the only way we could get a positive is if we take a positive times a positive, or we could take a negative times a negative. In both of those cases, we would end up with a positive for the last term. So in this case, I'm going to look at the middle term to tell me what that should be. Here it's a negative, so that means we're going to use 2 negative signs. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to figure out what should the last term be by forcing the last multiplication to work out. So we're going to look at what could I multiply to give me 24. And it's always helpful maybe to write out what our factors are. So we have 1 and 24, we would have 2 and 12, we would have 3 and 8, or 4 and 6. And if we're looking ahead, the last step, number 4, is our check step, which tells me that the outside and the inside multiplications should add up to our middle term. So if I'm looking at my factors of 24, I want to also kind of look ahead with the notion that I should end up being able to add the outside and inside multiplications and get negative 14. Well, if I look at my pairs, 2 and 12 are the factors that when I add them together I get 14. So I'm going to plug in 2 and 12. If you wanted to make it x minus 12 and then x minus 2, that would be fine as well. But this would be my final answer here, x minus 2 times x minus 12. Again, the outside in this case is negative 12x. The inside multiplication is negative 2x. They add up to negative 14x, which is what our middle term is. So that means we did it correctly. All right, let's move on to this week's continuation of reverse FOIL. If you recall from last week, I said that with reverse FOIL, we often think of it as more of a guess and check method, where we have to do a little more checking of our work, and we might not always know exactly which factors to use. But we follow that 4-step process that you saw on the first slide to kind of guide us through as much as possible. If I look at example 2, I have 2x squared plus 13x plus 15. And the first thing that you probably notice about this problem compared to all the other ones that we did is this right here, the 2 that's in front of the x squared. Because that's going to have an impact on our actual answer. I'm not going to be able to simply split x squared into x and x. In fact, my first step requires me now to split this up into 2x and x, because 2x times x would give me x squared. I'm going to follow the other steps the way I normally would. So I'm going to look at my signs, and I look at the last term here. It's a positive, which means I'm going to use the same sign. So if I look at the middle term, that's a positive. So I'm going to have 2 plus signs. And now I'm going to look for my factors of 15 that when I plug them in, hopefully they add up when I do the outside and inside multiplication to give me 13. So if I look, my factors of 15 are 1 and 15 and 3 and 5. The problem is if I look ahead to that check step, I'll notice 1 plus 15 does not equal 13, and 3 plus 5 does not equal 13. And the reason that we're not going to see either of these sets of factors add up to the middle term, again, comes back to the fact that we have this 2 here. Because now when I do the outside multiplication, I'm going to end up multiplying that factor by 2, and this is just going to multiply 1. So I want to know which pair of factors should I pick so that when I plug in the set and I multiply one of them by 2, then I'm going to be able to add the outside and inside to get 13. And this is where it's a little more guess and check. So maybe I tried the 1 and the 15, but I don't want the 2 to multiply to 15, so I put the 1 there. So then what I would see is that my outside multiplication, 2x times 1 is 2x. My inside multiplication is 15 times 1, which is 15x. That adds up to 17x. That is not what I have in the middle here. I have 13x. So that must mean the 15 and the 1 don't work in this case. And not just that I can switch them, because we said last week if the number doesn't work out, switch the factors maybe. That's not going to work here because if I take 2 times 15, that gives me 30. So I'm going to get rid of the 15 and 1 entirely, and I'm going to try one of my other sets, which has to be the 3 and the 5. So again, I'm just going to plug in, let's say we plug the 3 in first and then the 5. And then I'm going to check my answer. So outside 2x times 5 is 10x. And then I'm going to check the inside, which is just 3 times x, which is 3x. If I add those together, now I get 13x. That's what I wanted to end up with. So my final answer here is 2x plus 3 times x plus 5. So you can see here how having that extra number in front of the x squared makes it a little more difficult and changes things a little bit. Let's look at another example together. So here we have another example where I have this number out in front of the x squared. Sometimes we refer to as an a value. And this is 5 in this case. 5x squared minus 13x minus 6. So once again, when I go through my process of reverse FOIL and I want to force the first multiplication to work out, I need to split 5x squared into 5x and x. Now I'm going to go through and look at my signs. In this case, I notice that the last term is a negative. The only way that I could get a negative is from taking a positive times a negative. So I'm just going to plug in the plus and the minus. I'm not sure if this is going to be correct. That's why it's basically guess and check from here on out. My next step is to look at my last multiplication. So I want to end up with 6. Well, for 6, I could have either 1 and 6, or I could use the factors 2 and 3. So if I'm looking at what might help me get close to this middle term here, if I'm looking at which of these sets of factors might help me somehow get to negative 13, I have to remind myself that one of them is going to be multiplied by 5. So one of the shortcuts or things that I tell students to look for is there a number that when I multiply one of these factors by 5 gets me kind of close to the 13? And my first thought is, well, if I took 5 times 3, that's going to get me 15. That's pretty close. Maybe not the correct order yet, but I'm going to try that first. So I'm going to plug 3 in here and 2 in here. And now I'm going to do my check step. This is why it's important that we go through and do the check. I need to make sure that the outside plus the inside equals the middle term. So my outside multiplication here now is going to be 5x times 3. It's actually negative 3, which is negative 15x. And then my inside multiplication is going to be positive 2 times x, which is positive 2x. And now I combine those things, I add them together, I get negative 13x. It actually worked out exactly as I wanted to in this case, so that was a good guessing and checking. Let's say I switched the signs and I ended up with positive 13x. I would have wanted to switch them back. So you still follow those same problem solving skills that we talked about last week. Wrong sign, switch the order of the plus and the minus. If I have the wrong number entirely, try different factors. But in this case, 5x plus 2 times x minus 3 is our final answer. Let's move on to our next example. All right, so here in example 4, we have 3a squared minus 22a minus 16. I'm going to get you started, then I want you to pause and try it on your own. So to get us started, I'm going to help us set up the first part because we always want to split it into two binomials. We want to force the first multiplication in this case to give us the 3a squared. So that means I want to split 3a squared into 3a and a. Go ahead and pause. Try the rest of this problem on your own. All right, so your next step should have been to look at the last term and look at the sign. And since I see that it's a negative, I know a negative can only come from a positive times a negative. So I'm going to substitute in right away the plus and the minus sign. And let's say in this case I decided to do the minus and then the plus. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to force the last multiplication to work out the way we want it to. Meaning I need factors of 16. So I could use 1 and 16. I could use 2 and 8. I could use 4 and 4. So if I'm looking at those, I could either just start plugging them in and see what happens, or I can try and think ahead. Again, the shortcut is I know that one of these things is going to be multiplied by 3a. So if I look at my list of factors here, which one of these numbers when I multiply it by 3 gets me kind of close to my middle term, which would be 22. If you said 8, you would be correct. Let's try that. So I'm going to plug the 8 in here. That means I have to plug the 2 in here. And now I do my check step. So the check is that the outside plus the inside gives me negative 22a. In this case, the outside multiplication is 3a times 8, which is 24a. And the inside multiplication is negative 2 times a, which is negative 2a. If I combine those, I get positive 22a. And I have a slight problem because I have a positive 22 here, but I should have ended up with a negative 22. So the question is, how do I fix that? I switch the signs in this case. So I'm going to get rid of this minus sign here and this plus sign, and I'm going to switch them. I'm going to put the plus sign first and then the minus sign, because now it becomes 3a times negative 8, which is negative 24a, and becomes positive 2 times a, which is positive 2a. That ends up giving me a negative 22, which is what I wanted to end up with in the first place. So there's my final answer, 3a plus 2 times a minus 8. We have two more examples to look at together, and we're going to see that there's one other thing that we have to be careful of. So let's move on to example 5. All right, here we go. Example 5, 4x squared plus 8x plus 3. If I take a look for a minute at this problem, there's a fundamental difference between what we see here and what we have previously seen. And the key, again, has to do with our coefficient here of 4. And the big problem is that in this case, when I say that I want to split this up so that I get 4x squared, I no longer have just two numbers to use, because 4 could have factors of 1 and 4, or it could be 2 and 2. So the question is, which of those should I use, 1 and 4 or 2 and 2? Again, pick one, try it out, let's see what happens. So I'm going to pick x and 4x. All right, then I'm going to look at my signs. In this case, the last term is positive. That means I'm using the same sign, so I go to the middle. They're both pluses. All right, that's good. And then the last multiplication has to give me 3. Well, luckily I don't have much of a choice here. It has to be 1 and 3. So I'm just going to plug in 1 and 3. And this is where we do the check. So if I check the outside plus the inside, outside multiplication in this case, x times 3 gives me 3x. If I do the inside multiplication, 1 times 4x is 4x. I add those together, that gives me 7x. That's a problem because I was supposed to end up with 8x. So the 1 and the 3 don't work in this order, so maybe what I do is I switch them. I get rid of the 1 here, get rid of the 3 here, and instead I have 3 in the first set of parentheses, 1 there. So now I'm going to do my check again. Outside in this case, x times 1 equals 1x. Inside multiplication, 3 times 4x gives me 12x. I add those together, that gives me 13x. Again, does not work out the way I want it to. What I basically have just done is shown x and 4x do not work. So I must have to use the 2 and the 2. So let's get rid of all of this stuff first. All right, so it's going to have to get rid of that. And now that means I'm going to use 2x and 2x. And when I go back, I had to use 1 and 3. So I'll just plug in the 1 and the 3. Doesn't matter what order. Let's do our check. Outside equals 2x times 3, which is 6x. Inside equals 1 times 2x, which is 2x. I add those together. That gives me 8x. Hey, that's what I was supposed to end up with as my middle term. So this is good. That means this happens to be my final answer. 2x plus 1 times 2x plus 3. Could I have switched them? 2x plus 3 and then 2x plus 1? Sure, that would have been fine. Gives me the same answer. But you can see here where that extra guessing and checking needs to take place. Let's take a look at one last example. All right, we're at the last example here, number 6. We have 6x squared plus 17x minus 14. Again, the problem that we have here is this 6. And just like the last example, it's no longer just going to split up into 6x and x necessarily, because 6 has factors of 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. So I'm going to say, in this case, last time I started with 1 and 4 and it didn't work out, maybe I'll try 2x and 3x in this case. All right. Then we're going to go through. The next step is to look at our signs. And if you want to pause and try this on your own, that's fine. Feel free to do so. Let's keep working through. We have the last sign here is negative. That means I have to use one positive and one negative sign. So I'm going to put plus here, minus there. Don't know if that's what it's supposed to be, but we'll find out. Then I'm going to look at my last multiplication. The last multiplication has to give me 14. That must mean that I use factors of either 1 and 14 or 2 and 7. And again, keep in mind, our outside plus our inside multiplications should add up in this case to positive 17. So at this point, it's really a choice as far as which ones you want to try, but you want to be smart about it too. I want to end up with 17. If I look at my first set of factors, notice I have 14 here. Just think for a second. If I plug 14 here, 14 times 2 is 28. That's pretty far away from 17. If I plug 14 here, 14 times 3 is 42. That's even further away. So I'm actually going to stay away from the 1 and the 14, and I'm going to try the 2 and the 7 first. And I'm going to try plugging the 2 in and then the 7. And let's see. If I do my check, The outside in this case would be 2x times negative 7, which is negative 14x. The inside ends up being 2 times 3x. That's positive 6x. This adds up to negative 8x. And that's a problem. Doesn't work out. And normally we would say try different factors. But because of the 2 and the 3 here, I'm actually going to switch these first before I just give up on those factors working out. So I'm going to plug in the 7 here and then the 2 here. And now let's do our check again. So in this case, we're going to do the outside, which is 2 times negative 2x times negative 2, which is negative 4x. The inside multiplication is 7 times 3x, which is positive 21x. Add those together, negative 4 plus 21. That gives me positive 17x. That's what I actually wanted to end up with in this case. There's my final answer. 2x plus 7 times 3x minus 2. This process can be frustrating. I will be honest with you. It takes perseverance on your part because you need to go through your factors, not just for the 14, but you need to go through your factors for 6. If it doesn't work the first time, you might need to switch the factors like we did here. You might need to switch the signs. But if you're following those steps, trying to force the first multiplication, then looking at your signs, then trying to force the last multiplication, the most important thing you can do is your check, because that's going to tell you, did you get something incorrect or did you get the correct check? If you have questions this week, please let me know. We'll have our regular Zoom meetings this week. I would encourage you greatly to jump on this Wednesday with me so that we can go over some more examples of this before we move on to our next step in factoring next week. This is a really important lesson because everything you're going to do in Algebra 2 next year that deals with larger functions and polynomials will rely on you being able to factor. So this is probably the most important lesson that we've done thus far this year. And I hope to see you guys on Wednesday. Otherwise, I hope you're all doing well. I hope you guys are staying safe. I miss you guys, and I'll talk to you later. Be good.